All right, students. Section 4 of Chapter 7 deals with the ending of the Revolutionary War. So they've been at it for a while now, 4 years. And by 1780, the French have now started really contributing. They're sending men, they're sending ships, they're sending money. But most importantly is their fleet. Comte de Rochambeau in 1780 brings his fleet and brings a second wave, a second group of ships, a second fleet. And he himself joins up with Washington just off New York City, just to the north. And they wait there till the second fleet comes because he tells Washington, I've got a second fleet coming. And Washington knows, well, I just have to wait now because it's in the bag, kind of. Because that was really the best advantage that the British had over the rebels. So Lafayette and Mad Anthony Wayne are in the south pushing north. And Lafayette had a spy working with the British. And the spy let Lafayette know that the British were encamped at Yorktown on this peninsula. Now that sounds like a stupid move on the British general's part, Cornwallis. Cornwallis didn't think it was stupid because he had no idea that there was a French fleet coming. He thought that it was a good idea. Remember, I told you that in the last screencast. I said he thought it was a good idea because he felt that this was a good place for him to be resupplied by his own fleet or evacuated if he had to be, and moved to a different port. He wasn't going to give up the fight. It wasn't about giving up the fight. It was about putting himself and his troops in a good place to be either resupplied or evacuated and moved to a new place to fight on. It wasn't about surrendering. So he has no idea what's coming at him, but he's about to be surrounded and trapped. And that's exactly what happens. Washington and Lafayette pound at him by land and keep him from being able to get away by land. And the French fleet comes at him by sea and keeps his own navy from trying to help him. And he has to give up. And so by October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders at the Battle of Yorktown. You must remember the Battle of Yorktown. It is very important. It's going to be tested every which way to Sunday. In fact, we have an aircraft carrier named Yorktown. I'm not sure it's still in service today, but if it's not, we will again probably have an aircraft carrier named Yorktown because it's such an important battle for us. Okay, so, and I'm being silly at the top of the page with my Yorktown images. Obviously, the battle was of the rebels, not of the carrier. The British still do hold a port city in the south, port cities of Savannah and Charlestown, and I'm sure eventually they realize that Cornwallis has surrendered, but there's not much they can do to help him. And you need to also understand that after the Battle of Yorktown, there are some other small skirmishes and battles, but this is the end of the Revolutionary War. Once that battle is over, it's just, the British realize that it is ridiculous to go on fighting. It's just too expensive. And you have to understand, and I'm going to talk about this and explain a little bit more in depth in class. The next frame talks about some, but I'm going to go more in depth in class. The British people had begun putting pressure on their own government to stop with this now. They were done with it at this point. And so we'll talk more in class about that. So it says, in what ways were those things expensive? Well, war is always expensive in money, especially if you're the one who's fighting at a distance. And you know that. You've lived your whole life where we are fighting a war at a distance, and you hear constantly about how expensive that is. Secondly, war is expensive in that it takes a country's working generation of men and women in present day, although we're not drafting, we're not just taking a whole generation at this point. But back as near as World War II, you were drafting and you were taking a whole generation of people out of the workforce. And that's a problem. And we'll talk again more about that in class. And then third, the war usually hurts trade and the economy of all the countries involved. It wasn't just hurting the colonies. It was hurting Great Britain, which is why the people of Britain were pressuring their own country to be done with this. They want to go back to business as usual. As I've said, money always talks. And money was getting very loud over in Britain and saying, hey, you know what? We just want to go back to business as usual. This is our best market for our goods, and we want to go back to trading with them. Okay, so you need to know these points, why the Americans won, because again, this stuff is likely to be tested. And you really should kind of know, okay, they were the underdogs. No one on the planet thought they would win. And looking at it on paper, they should never have won the Revolutionary War. Washington goes home with his men. He doesn't go on to be president right away. That doesn't happen right away. But the Americans won for a couple reasons. They're fighting on their own ground. They knew the terrain. They knew the people. They know who's safe and who's not. They know where to run and hide. They know which roads are good, which ones aren't. They know the climate. They know the geography. The British have to move troops and supplies halfway across the world, and that's not easy even today. So it's even harder back in those days. So those are a couple reasons why the Americans won. Also, the Americans became expert at wilderness fighting, having learned it from Native Americans. They had been living over here for generations, over 100 years. They had seen how Native Americans fight firsthand, and they were experienced with it. The British were not, and they did not adapt to it. Now, the British were very good at controlling the cities. Once the British took control of a city, a port city especially, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, that was their tactic. Take control of the cities, maintain control of the cities. Well, that was great. But as soon as they moved their troops out of that city to go fight somewhere else, they would lose control of the city. So they could control the port cities, but not the countryside. And not everybody lives in the port cities, so that's a problem. And last and most important, the United States would not have won the Revolutionary War without help from France. It is why you will never see us ever not fight on the side of France in a war. That is why we were at their side almost immediately in World War I and again in World War II. And if there's a problem, we will be there for the French. It is simply the way things are. Every school child in America is told this. Everyone knows it, that if it were not for the French, our country probably would not have been born. It's that simple. So we owe them a huge debt, and everyone knows it, and everyone is taught it. It's that simply that way. Now, the Patriots were also fighting figuratively and literally for their freedom. The consequences for them if they're defeated is death. Those people that signed the Declaration of Independence, maybe on one of those Dear Fridays, I can pull out a book and read to you. Instead of having you read, I'll read to you about some of the things that happened to those people. It wasn't sweetness and light for them. One of the men had his son captured, and they said, if you will recant, if you will say, I was wrong for signing the Declaration, we'll let your son go. Other than that, we're going to hang him. So it wasn't good for them. I should pull the book out and read to you on Dear Friday once in a while and let you know how bad it was. Also, Washington had better spies. I have at the bottom some pictures. There's a really good book written called George Washington's Secret Six, and I read it, and it's perfectly suitable for junior high students if you wanted to read it about George Washington's spy ring. There's a little decoder thing at the bottom that looks like one of the decoders that they used back in Washington's time. And the picture over on the right-hand side is a picture of the NSA building in Langley, Virginia. It is where our spying is done today. Washington would be so proud to see the spying that we have done today, and would be, I'm sure, fascinated with the electronic spying that we do. So he simply had better spies. He had better spies than the British. Again, he was using slaves as spies. He was using women as spies. He was using people as spies that the British never suspected. And so his spy ring, while it started off poorly, he developed it and it became an important part of his victory.